Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is a video to show you in depth how to set up and wire Corsair's PWM ARGB fans. I'm going to show you how to connect them to the motherboard and different things that you can do to use different controllers so that you can control the RGB lighting, get it to match up with what's going on the screen, control all the RGB and fan power directly from your motherboard or with Corsair's iCue software and more. But just for the sake of clarity, I don't mean these fans or other variants that have these connectors on them that say 2 RGB hub on the end. So if you see these ones, and that's what your fans look like with that yellow 2 RGB hub cable, then you don't want this video. You want a separate video that I'll link to down in the description below that I've gone into depth on before on how to connect those fans, because these ones won't connect directly to the motherboard. The fan power will, but the RGB won't. Hence the 2 RGB hub, and you'll need a Commander Core or a Commander Pro in order to connect those up and to control them with Corsair's iCue software. So it's a bit more complicated, but there's a separate video down below which will help you in depth on how to do that. But if you're using something like Corsair's RS120 or RS140 fans, these are PWM and ARGB, which means you can connect them directly to your motherboard, or alternatively to the Commander Duo, or to an alternative ARGB controller, like the Thermalright one that I'm going to show you. And there are various different ways to connect them and control them, and different benefits of doing so. So whether you want to use Corsair's iCue software, your motherboard software, or something like SignalRGB to control the RGB lighting, I'm going to show you all the different ways to do that and all the things you need to know in order to do that. So stick with me and use the timestamps down below to jump to relevant points if you need to, and I'll link to other videos in the description which will also help. So at the time I'm making this video, this logic applies to the RS140 and RS120 ARGB fans. Now you can get the RS140s in dual packs and the RS120s in triple packs, so they come with 3 fans in there. These are daisy chainable fans. You can also get reverse blade versions of these, or reverse rotor fans, which change the way the airflow works. More on that in a second. And the wiring logic is the same no matter which fans you're using. These are all daisy chainable fans, so the logic is very straightforward in terms of connecting them up. The reverse blade fans are only different in that the blades themselves face in a different direction, have a different curve to them, so they change the way the airflow works, but more on that in a little while. So with an RS140 pack, you get 2 fans per pack, and then you get extension leads and screws. And with the RS120 fans, you get 3 fans, the cables and the screws for those. Now, if you take a look at the fan, you'll see this is the back of the fan. You can tell by the fins at the rear of it, and you'll see we have a few different connectors coming off it. There's 4 connectors, 2 male and 2 female. But also importantly, you'll see on the side there are a couple of arrows which basically show you the airflow direction. So this arrow indicates that the front of the fan pulls the air through, and then it comes out the other side. So this logic means that when you're installing fans, you'd usually face the fan facing outwards, so the fan blade faces outwards on the front of the case, for example, to pull cold air into the case to cool it down. That's an intake fan at the front of the case. And then if you want intake fans on the bottom or the side, with standard fans, you'd install them face down to the bottom or face outwards to the side, so that the rear is facing inwards to the case, and that way it's intake. So here, for example, the side and bottom are intake and the top and rear are exhaust. And that's the logic there. Obviously, using reverse blade fans is a little bit different. So you can see the Corsair Frame 4500X here, for example, that has side reverse blade fans as standard. And in this build, I've used reverse blade fans on the side and on the bottom, and that way the fan blades are visible throughout the case. It's worth noting, though, that the performance of the reverse blade fans isn't as good, so the airflow, static pressure, and others aren't as good, which means that they're not as powerful in terms of cooling. But if you want to get rid of the backs of the fans and just have the front visible, making for a much nicer looking build, then you can swap out those standard blade fans for the reverse blade fans and end up with a build that looks like this. It's a lot cleaner, it's nicer to look at, it's got a better aesthetic. It doesn't negatively impact performance too much, and yet we still have the same logic. We've got intake on the bottom and side, and then exhaust at the top and rear. So with that out of the way, let's look at the basic wiring connecting to your motherboard, and then I'll get into using the different controllers. So with the single fan, you'll find that you have male and female connections of fan power and the RGB connection. So this is system fan header or chassis fan header, and then 5-volt RGB connections. With these fans, the idea is to connect them together. So you take one fan and you connect it to the next fan, and then you connect it to the next fan, and then you connect it to your system. So, for example, we take the male connector on one fan and plug it into the female connector on the next fan for the RGB. So that's the RGB connection, like that. And then you'll do the same thing for the fan power as well. So you take the male connection on the fan on the left and plug it into the female connector on the fan on the right. So you're just plugging that in like this, making sure it slots into place properly and that the pins go into the holes. Notice the little plastic notch on there to make sure it lines up properly, and that's how that connector works. So that is the logic of connecting those two fans together. You repeat this process for the next fan in the chain as well, whether using the RS140s or the RS120 fans. So we just want to connect these up, chain those together, and that way you'll only end up with a couple of cables that will need to be connected to the motherboard by the end of this from this group of 3 fans. This is better than Corsair's previous fans where you had 2 cables per fan, so an RGB connection and a fan power connector that needed to be connected to the motherboard or a Commander core, for example. So it's fairly straightforward, although it might look a bit complicated to begin with. Now, in the pack of the fans, you should have had an extension lead for both the fan power and the RGB connection. Notice that these are female and male connections again, and pay attention to that because you have to keep that logic in mind when connecting these up. Because what you want to do is to plug the female fan connection from that extension lead into the male connector on one end of your chain of fans for the fan power, and then the male connector from the extension lead for the RGB connection into the female connector on the RGB on the fan chain. The reason for that is we need to make sure that the female connectors on the extension lead are then available to be plugged into your motherboard. So you'll see 5-volt RGB header or chassis fan header or system fan header for the fan power, and those both need to be female in order to plug into the motherboard. So then you're looking for the fan ports on your motherboard if you want to connect directly to the motherboard and have control over these via your BIOS and your motherboard software. So as mentioned, you'll look for system fan header for the fan power and 5-volt RGB connections for the RGB connector. You should find these along the bottom of the motherboard with any luck. You'll see that there are multiple chassis fan headers on the bottom of this motherboard, for example, and most modern motherboards will have some along the bottom, some at the top, perhaps some at the side as well. So chassis fan header or system fan header, and you want to basically plug the extension lead into that. It also has that little plastic notch on the port, the same way the fans do when you connect them together, so watch out for that as you try and plug it in, because it can make it a little bit fiddly, especially when it's in the case. Obviously, I'm going to show you the wiring outside the case, so it's really easy and visible, but you'll actually want to do it when everything's installed and plug it in like that. The 5-volt RGB header is usually a 3-pin ARGB connection, multiple points on your motherboard, sometimes at the top, usually a couple at the bottom. It depends on your motherboard. You might have to refer to your motherboard manual to see if this exists. Some motherboards don't even have any, but most do, and some might only have one, so we need to watch out for that. And that's where a Commander Duo will come in useful later on. I'll talk to you about that as we get to it. But this plugs in there, and again it's 3-pin, so make sure it's plugged in properly because you can only plug it in one way, and it can be quite fiddly to do. But if you plug both those cables in, now all 3 of those fans that I showed you in that chain will have both power and RGB, and you'll be able to connect them up and control them with the BIOS and your motherboard software. Now, in theory, you can have another group of fans, so 2 lots of RS fans, whether it's the RS120 or RS140 fans or the reverse blade fans, and you can plug them both into the motherboard with separate connectors. So I've got 2 5-volt RGB headers and 2 chassis fan headers. But what if you want to add more fans in? So if you want to add more, we've only got a couple of RGB connections on the motherboard. That's obviously an issue. So this is the solution potentially, especially if you want to control your RGB lighting on those fans with Corsair's iCue software, because you can do that if you buy an extra thing, which is the Commander Duo, and then you have the ability to then control the RGB lighting. And this is useful if you've got Corsair products in your system as well, like RAM, like I had, for example. From that, you can use it within Corsair's iCue software. You can control the RGB lighting, use the various different effects from that system, and easily set it up. So the Commander Duo is a separate purchase. It's not too expensive, but this allows you to connect up to 12 fans to it, and then you don't have to use the motherboard connections. So in the box, you get the Commander Duo itself, some temperature sensors and other bits. You also have the ability to use this with iCue Link, although I'm not going to cover that in this video because that's a separate thing. But you'll see it has fan 1 and fan 2 power and RGB connections on the bottom. And it also has USB and SATA ports on the top, which is very important because you will need to connect those things up. And then a button to switch between iCue Link mode and ARGB. Make sure this switch is flipped to the ARGB mode if you're going to use this. Make sure it's in the right position there, otherwise this won't work properly. So what we need to do here is slightly different because you actually need to group your fans together into a group of 6. So instead of just 3 with the extension leads, we want to put them into groups of 6. So the 3 on the right hand side now I'm going to connect to the ones on the top. Imagine, if you will, that's your front intake fans and then your top exhaust fans, basically just connecting the cables together from one group of fans to the next. Now the reason you need to do this is we only have 2 ports on the Commander Duo, so I'm going to use these to connect up to one port on there, and then the other fans will be connected to the other, and I'll show you what I mean in a second. But essentially all 3 of these then connect up to the Commander Duo. So the 5V RGB connection goes to the ARGB ports, either 1 or 2, and then the fan power connector goes into fan port 1 or 2. So you're using the extension lead from the right hand group of fans in this instance to run to this, and that way the fan power and RGB is passing from those extension cables through all 6 fans rather than just 3. So you can do that quite easily, as you can see, but you do need to make sure you connect a couple of other cables, one of which is the USB connection. So this is USB-C on one end that plugs into the top of the Commander Duo. The other end of that then plugs into the bottom middle of your motherboard, and you should find a spare USB port at the bottom middle, hopefully, that you can plug into. You can see what it looks like here and how that plugs in. This is essential because you'll need this in order to be able to control it via the Corsair's iCue software. You'll also need SATA power. So from your power supply unit, you should have had some flat cables that look something like this. These are usually used for SSDs and hard disk drives. You plug one end of the cable into the SATA or PATA ports on the power supply end. So you plug the Type 5 connector in, and this instance on this Corsair power supply, and then the other end of it has multiple connectors on it that you can use to connect up SSDs and hard disk drives, or in this case, to add it in and connect up the Commander Duo. So at the top, you'll find the SATA port there. This is essential because if you don't do this, the fans won't get enough power via the Commander Duo in order to power them. And so you'll need to do this. Make sure you have a spare SATA cable that plugs into this. It only plugs in one way because it's got a shape to it. So you need to watch out for the little plastic notch there and make sure that's connected up. So here you can see what that basic wiring logic looks like. 6 fans connected up. So for the bottom fans and the side fans in this instance, I'm going to daisy chain those 2 groups of fans together. So these bottom fans, I'm now going to use the male and female connectors to connect them at the bottom, and then I'll have the extension leads from the other end to plug into the Commander Duo. You can apply this logic, obviously, to 2 groups of fans in your system. So I'm also doing that with the top fans on the radiator and the rear exhaust fan in this case, connecting those up. So 6 connected on one of these connections with those 2 cables, and then 4 in the other connector. Now the Commander Duo is slightly magnetic, so it will stick to your case if you've got a metal part there, but it also comes with 3M stickers if you need to stick it permanently to that. And then you just plug in your fan power and ARGB connections from the groups of fans you want to plug in. Obviously, we're limited to a maximum of 12. You can only have 6 fans per port, and that's for fan power and RGB. So don't go over the top on that, because if you add in extra, you'll find it's not getting enough power, the RGB lighting won't be good enough, etc. And do make sure you plug in the SATA power cable from this. And you might be prudent to use a spare one, so not connecting other devices to this, and use a separate cable if you want to plug in SSDs and hard disk drives. That way you'll ensure the Commander Duo is getting enough power. And then a USB cable from that to the motherboard. On this rear connect motherboard, you see that's in the bottom middle, and we'll plug that in down there as well. And then that's all the connections needed for all of these fans. So in this case, the bottom and side fans are connected to one port, and the radiator fans and the rear fan are connected to the other, and the RGB connections are all sorted out as well. So go into Corsair's iCue software and you should find that you've got firmware updates, maybe a software update that requires iCue to restart in order to make sure the Commander Duo is set up properly. And then it should appear there as a separate device. Now, if you click into it, you'll see there's lighting setup and lighting effects. You'll also notice that the two different groups have different colors displayed in the real world. And you can go in and you can choose whether you've connected lighting strips or fans to it. And you've got manual or automatic LED detection. I'd recommend using automatic. But then you'll also find that you can go into the lighting section and you can choose from a variety of different lighting profiles and presets, which you can then apply. You can adjust the speed, the brightness, and all sorts of other things from here. And this is obviously then applying to all the groups of fans that are connected. If you use Lighting Link in there, you can also get it to apply to Corsair RAM and other products that you've got connected. So I've got Dominator RAM in here, for example, which you can see is also changing its RGB effect along with that. So as you can see, this is a good way to control the RGB lighting and fan power for Corsair's PWM ARGB fans if you want to use the Corsair iCue software to do so. From the configuration tool, you can also set the fan speed between quiet, balanced, and extreme, and this will obviously adjust that accordingly, and you can create your own custom curve in here as well, so you can also set that up. But you are controlling all the fans connected to that port at once, so you don't have individual control over each of the fans, is worth bearing in mind. So that's 6 fans on one port and then 4 on the other in this instance being adjusted on the fly. In the top left, you'll also see device memory mode. If you use this, you can then set specific things to happen when iCue isn't running. So doing this, for example, applying quiet fan profiles and also the watercolor RGB and then saving it, means that this will then be the case whenever you turn your PC on or whenever iCue is not running. It will default to these specific things, which is very handy. An alternative to the Commander Duo is something like the Thermalright ARGB hub, which, as you can see, has loads of ARGB ports, and you can plug in a load of devices to this. So this is a handy alternative if you want to use your motherboard's RGB software or something like SignalRGB or OpenRGB, because it allows you to connect the fans up to this and then to the motherboard and then control the RGB lighting. And this can be used to then make the RGB change according to what's on the screen as well. So like the Commander Duo, the Thermalright hub will mount in the case with stickers, and then you just plug in the fan extension leads to it for the RGB connections at least. The fan power connections will go straight to the motherboard still, but the RGB connections are plugging in here. And as you can see, if you've got loads of fans, more than 12 for example, you can plug those in pretty easily to that. Now, this does require SATA power, so you need to make sure you've got a power supply unit with the relevant cables. This is the same cables you use for SSDs and hard disk drives. You should hopefully have spare of these. So just make sure this is plugged into the power supply unit on the right-hand side, as you can see me doing here, to make sure the fans are getting enough power for the RGB lighting. And then on the other side, you have this extension cable, which is 5-volt RGB connection, which plugs into the left-hand side of the Thermalright hub, and then the other end plugs into a spare 5-volt RGB header on your motherboard. If you've got one, you can see I've got one on the top left of this rear connect motherboard, for example. We can plug that in there. So rather than using a USB connection, it uses that, which means it doesn't need any software apart from what comes with your motherboard. So your motherboard software, and you can then control the RGB lighting that way, or alternatively use SignalRGB. Now, if you've got loads of fans and you're putting absolutely loads of fans into your system and you run out of system fan headers or chassis fan headers, which is more than plausible if you're doing push-pull or if you're putting loads of fans into it. Obviously, we've got a lot of fans with a lot of connections on them, and you might come unstuck. You might find you haven't got enough connections. Obviously, the RGB has been dealt with, but what about the fan power? This is another alternative. This is a Thermalright controller, which basically allows you to plug in both fan power and RGB to it. So this device, as you can see, has the mix of both on either side. You've got fan power and RGB connections on either side, and then you essentially just have SATA power on one end and then the extension cables on the other end to plug into the motherboard. So this is a repeater of sorts, so you can plug in multiple fans to it and connect up both the 5V RGB and fan power to it, and then power it with the SATA power and just connect it to the motherboard. Now this has the same sort of logic in that eventually you'd control the fan power with the BIOS and the RGB lighting with your motherboard software. But obviously it will be for all of the fans connected to it, and that means you can't individually control the fan speed of those groups of fans. But it is worth considering if you're just adding in lots of fans into the system. Now with both of these setups, where you've got it connected directly to the motherboard or to one of these repeaters, you'd then use your BIOS and go in and then do the fan tuning in there. Make sure you set any headers that you're using to PWM mode so that the fans can actually go to the right speeds. So it's worth selecting those within the BIOS. And you can do fan tuning if you have that capability as well, which is worth doing, because sometimes you get AI in the BIOS, which will then basically adjust the fans accordingly and make sure they're set up correctly. Or you can set up your own fan curves if you know what you're doing a bit more. And if you've connected up specific groups to specific headers in the motherboard, you know which ones are going to be used for cooling the CPU and which for use for cooling the GPU, for example. You can account for that sort of thing as well, so you can get a bit more intelligent about it. Whereas if you're using a repeater and a controller, then that becomes a bit more difficult. But do that and then save changes and reset, and you'll have that set up. Now, if you've done this, you can also use SignalRGB or OpenRGB, because those things are connected to the motherboard, and that will allow you to then choose from various different lighting effects in there. This is a free bit of software. You can pay a premium price to get extra unlocks for it, but even straight out of the box, it will give you various different RGB effects that will apply to anything connected to the motherboard, and this includes Corsair's RS120 and RS140 ARGB fans, as you can see, so you can just easily apply a load of different profiles to it and get it looking really nice. Benefit of this is it also allows you to select various different effects which will also respond to what's going on the screen, so you can get it to change color and effect based on what's happening on the screen, which really makes for an immersive gaming experience and adds to the overall effect. Hopefully you found all these tips useful. If you did, consider liking the video and maybe even subscribing to come back and see more. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions, and don't forget to check out the links in the description to more related content. Thanks for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.